The torch flames danced wildly in a night wind, casting long shadows across Miriam Harper's face as she clutched her 6-year-old daughter to her chest. 6 men on horseback surrounded her crumbling front porch. Their faces were twisted with an anger that felt older than the town itself, a righteous judgment passed down through generations. The horses snorted and stamped in the darkness, their unease a mirror of the tension that hung thick and suffocating in the air. "You poisoned your husband, witch!" Tom Garrett shouted from his saddle, his voice a ragged tear in the fabric of the night. It carried across the empty land, a verdict already delivered. That child deserves better than a murderer for a mother. Miriam's whole body trembled as she held Sarah tighter. The little girl buried her face in her mother's worn dress, her small shoulders shaking with terrified sobs that made no sound. Desperation finally cracked the dam of Miriam's pride. She fell to her knees in the dirt, a single broken movement, still holding her daughter close, as if she could absorb her into her own body. "Please," she begged, the words swallowed by the wind. Tears streamed down her hollow cheeks, carving clean paths through the grime of poverty and fear. "Please don't take my child. She's all I have. I didn't. I swear to God I didn't." "The law is the law, Mrs. Harper," Sheriff Watson said coldly as he dismounted. His boots hit the ground with a heavy, final thud that seemed to echo in the silence. "Little Sarah's going to the orphanage in Silver Ridge. It's already been decided by the town council. There's nothing more to discuss." Sarah's terrified screams finally broke free, piercing the night as rough hands reached toward her. The child clung to her mother with all her might, her cries cutting through the darkness like a knife. Miriam wrapped her arms around her daughter, a human shield refusing to yield, even as the men moved closer, their faces grim and determined. Then a single rifle shot cracked through the air. Everyone froze. The horses reared and whinnied, their fear a sudden chaotic explosion in the tense standoff. The men's hands stopped mid-reach. Even Sarah's screams quieted to frightened whimpers, her small body instinctively understanding the shift in power. The sound of the gunshot still echoed across the empty prairie, a question hanging in the air. From the darkness beyond the circle of torchlight, a figure on horseback emerged. He moved slowly, deliberately, his horse's hooves crunching against the dry earth with a steady, unhurried rhythm. The rider sat tall in his saddle, silent and still as stone. His rifle was pointed at the sky, a gesture of peace that was completely contradicted by his eyes. Cold and steady, they promised a violence that would be swift and absolute if necessary. "No one," the man said quietly, his voice like gravel and iron, "is taking that child." Sheriff Watson's hand moved toward his own gun, but something in the stranger's eyes made him pause. The man wasn't just armed, he was ready. There was a difference, and the sheriff knew it. "This is none of your concern, Rollins. We're acting within the law here." The man called Rollins kept his rifle ready, his gaze never wavering from the sheriff. "Then the law needs fixing." But this wasn't just about a broken law. This was about a town's dark secret. How did a poor widow end up on her knees begging for her child's life? And who was this silent rancher willing to stand against 6 armed men for a woman he barely knew? The answer began 3 months earlier, on a day when the sun burned so hot it seemed to melt the very air itself. A day that started a chain reaction no one could have predicted. Eli Rollins squinted against the blazing sun, the light so sharp it felt like needles in his eyes. His horse plodded along the dusty trail toward Dry Creek, each step a small puff of red earth. The heat pressed down on everything like a physical weight, making even the simple act of breathing feel like work. Red dust kicked up from his horse's hooves, clinging to his worn clothes, his weathered face, and the sweat on his skin. He'd been riding since dawn from his ranch 40 miles north, and every muscle in his body ached with a dull, familiar fire. All this distance, all this effort, for a few sacks of barley. The thought made him shake his head with a grim irony. The drought had hit harder this year than most, turning lush green fields into a cracked, dead earth, and drying up streams that usually ran year-round. His horses needed feed if they were going to survive the season, and he'd run through his own supplies weeks ago. Town was the last place Eli wanted to be. He preferred the vast, crushing quiet of his ranch, the simple company of his animals, the solitude that let him forget the wife and son he'd buried years ago. But necessity had a way of making decisions for a man, of dragging him back into a world he'd rather leave behind. Dry Creek finally appeared on the horizon, rising from the desert like a collection of tired, sun-bleached bones. The false-fronted buildings leaned under the weight of years and heat, their paint peeling away in long, curling strips. Faded signs creaked in the hot wind, whispering names of businesses long gone. A few horses stood tied to hitching posts, their heads hung low, too exhausted by the heat to do anything but stand and suffer in silence. The whole town smelled of dust, sweat, and the sour tang of whiskey drifting out from the saloon doors. Eli swung down from his horse in front of Morrison's general store and tied the reins to the post. He patted his horse's hot, damp neck and murmured, "Won't be long, boy." The animal's only response was a tired snort, a puff of hot air in the stillness. Inside the store, the air was cooler, but heavy and stagnant. Wooden shelves sagged under the weight of bolts of cloth, jars of beans, boxes of ammunition, and rusted tools that looked like they hadn't been touched since the town was founded. The floorboards creaked under Eli's heavy boots as he walked toward the counter, his spurs making a soft, jingling sound. Chester Morrison, the storekeeper, was talking loudly to two ranchers, his chest puffed up with self-importance. "I told her last week, no more credit," Morrison said, his voice loud enough for the whole store to hear, intended as both gossip and a public service announcement. "A woman's got to learn to manage better. That Miriam Harper's always been trouble, if you ask me." Tom Garrett sneered from where he leaned against a barrel of pickles. "Trouble before her husband died, and worse after. Some women just attract misfortune, I suppose," another man added with a dark, knowing chuckle. "Or cause it." Eli said nothing. He had learned long ago that small towns ran on gossip the way horses ran on oats, and getting involved in other people's business was the quickest way to make enemies you didn't need. He kept his face neutral, a mask of indifference he had perfected over years of solitude, and stepped forward to the counter. "Afternoon," Eli said, his voice low and even, cutting through their conversation. "I'll take 3 sacks of barley." Morrison looked up, his expression shifting instantly into a merchant's practiced smile. "Eli Rollins. Haven't seen you in town for months. 3 sacks, you said. That'll be $12. Eli laid the bills down on the scarred wooden counter. Morrison reached for them, but before his thick fingers could close around the money, the bell above the door rang out, sharp and clear. The conversation died instantly. Every head in the store turned toward the door. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, pressing down with a weight of judgment and hostility that was almost a physical force. A woman stepped inside, and Eli felt the shift in the room like a change in the weather. She was younger than he'd expected from the men's talk, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a simple, severe knot. She wore a faded calico dress that had been mended more times than he could count, the stitches careful but obvious. Her boots were worn nearly through at the soles. But despite the clear signs of poverty, she held her back straight and her chin lifted with a defiant dignity that dared the room to break her. Through the front window, Eli could see a small girl waiting outside. Dark-haired like her mother, she stood perfectly still with old, watchful eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Morrison," the woman said, her voice soft but clear, refusing to be intimidated. "I need flour, salt, and a tin of lard." Morrison's face hardened like cooling iron. "Cash up front, Mrs. Harper. You know my policy." So this was the widow they'd been talking about. Eli watched as she opened a small, threadbare purse and placed a few coins on the counter. Even from where he stood, Eli could see it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Morrison counted the coins slowly, deliberately, dragging out her shame for everyone in the room to witness. He pushed them around with one fat finger, making a great show of adding them up in his head. Finally, he looked up with a cruel, triumphant smile. "This will cover half the flour," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "No salt, no lard." Miriam Harper's hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed steady. "Then I'll take what it covers." Tom Garrett pushed himself off from the barrel, a nasty smirk spreading across his face. "Maybe you should consider other ways of earning money, Mrs. Harper. A widow's got to make her way somehow after all. The suggestion in his voice was as clear as it was ugly. Eli watched as a fire flashed in Miriam Harper's dark eyes. She turned on Garrett like a cornered animal, a woman who had taken too many insults to let another one pass in silence. "I manage honestly, Mr. Garrett," she said sharply, her words like chips of ice. "Which is more than some people in this town can say." "Honest women don't poison their husbands," the other rancher muttered, just loud enough to be heard throughout the store. The words fell like a stone into still water, the ripples of accusation touching everyone. Miriam's face went pale, all the blood draining from her cheeks, leaving her looking fragile and ghost-like. But she didn't back down. She didn't run. She stood her ground, a solitary island in a sea of hate, and turned back to Morrison. "My flour, Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, her dignity a shield. Morrison leaned forward across the counter, cruelty curling at the corners of his mouth like smoke. "Prices have gone up, Mrs. Harper. Especially for your kind. Those coins might buy you a cup of flour, if that." Something tightened in Eli's chest. He'd spent years minding his own business, keeping his head down, staying out of other people's troubles because his own had been enough to break him. He'd lost too much already to risk getting involved in a town's petty, vicious cruelties. But standing there, watching this woman trying to buy food for her child, while grown men mocked her pain and kicked her when she was down, something in him refused to stay silent any longer. Eli's jaw tightened. Before he could talk himself out of it, before the voice of his past could warn him away, he stepped forward and laid $2 silver on the counter beside her meager coins. The metallic clink of the coins seemed deafening in the suddenly silent store. "Add what the lady needs to my order," Eli said calmly, his eyes fixed on Morrison's face, a silent challenge passing between them. The room froze. Every person in the store stared at him as if he'd just grown a second head. Miriam Harper turned to face him, and up close, Eli could see the hollow places in her cheeks where hunger had carved away at her. He saw the careful patches on her dress, the worn leather of her boots, the deep, soul-crushing exhaustion in her eyes that no amount of sleep could ever fix. But more than that, he saw pride warring with desperation, dignity fighting a losing battle against raw, animal need. "I can't accept charity," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly on the last word. "You're not accepting charity," Eli said, keeping his tone matter of fact. He never took his eyes off Morrison's reddening face. "Your store made an error in my favor last time I was here. Overcharged me for some supplies. This just squares us up. Isn't that right, Morrison?" The storekeeper's face flushed a deep, angry red, but he wasn't fool enough to challenge Eli Rollins' steady gaze or call him a liar in front of witnesses. Eli had a reputation for being quiet, but also for meaning what he said. After a long, tense moment that stretched for an eternity, Morrison gave a single jerky nod, his lips pressed into a thin, angry line. Miriam's voice shook, but she held it steady through sheer force of will. "Flour, salt, lard, and a small bag of sugar." She paused, then added so quietly Eli almost didn't hear it. "And a peppermint stick." "For my daughter," Eli said simply, his voice gentle but firm. "Whatever she needs." Then he turned away, giving Miriam the dignity of not watching as Morrison filled her order with barely controlled rage. He could feel the weight of every man's stare pressing against his back, physical things. He'd marked himself now. He'd stood with the town's outcast, the woman they'd all decided was a murderer, and worse. Whatever consequences came from that choice, they would be his to bear. When Miriam's packages were wrapped and ready, she paused beside him. For a moment she just stood there, and Eli could feel her searching his face, looking for the hidden price that usually followed such acts of kindness. Men in this world didn't help women like her without expecting something in return. He could see that bitter belief written in every line of her careful expression. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll repay you somehow. I promise." "No need, ma'am," Eli replied, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture his mother had taught him a lifetime ago. a gesture of respect he hadn't used in years. She held his gaze for another heartbeat, still looking for the trap, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Finding nothing but honest concern in his weathered face, she gathered her packages and left the store with her head held high, her spine straight, despite the weight of judgment that pressed down on her from every corner of the room. Eli watched through the window as she walked down the dusty street. Her small frame was burdened not just by the parcels in her arms, but by something far heavier, the crushing weight of a town's condemnation, of being judged and found guilty without a trial, of fighting every single day just to survive. "You've made a mistake, Rollins," Morrison muttered as he finally bagged Eli's barley, his voice low and venomous. "That woman is nothing but trouble. Mark my words, you'll regret this." Eli picked up his sacks of grain without answering. But at the door, he paused and looked back at the men in the store, his gaze sweeping over their judgmental faces. "Seems to me," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the still air, "a woman trying to feed her child isn't the one making trouble here." Outside, the sun was beginning its slow drop toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, like a fire on the edge of the world. Eli loaded his supplies onto his horse and mounted up, ready to head north to his ranch and the solitude he preferred. But his eyes followed Miriam Harper's small figure until she disappeared into the poorer part of town, where the houses leaned against each other for support and the streets turned to mud when it rained. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he'd only come to town for grain, nothing more. He'd done a good deed, a small act of rebellion against the town's cruelty, and that was the end of it. Tomorrow he'd be back at his ranch, and Miriam Harper would be someone else's concern. But as Eli rode out of Dry Creek, the image of her stayed with him. The fire in her eyes in the face of their cruelty. The dignity she wore like armor even as her hands trembled. The way she'd looked at her daughter through that dusty window with a love so fierce it could burn down the world. He'd crossed a line that day in Morrison's store, though he didn't yet understand just how much it would change the course of his life. He didn't know that 3 days later he'd find himself turning his horse back toward that widow's broken-down farmhouse. He didn't know that a small girl's solemn old eyes would haunt his dreams. He didn't know that he was about to stop running from life and start fighting for it again. All he knew, as the sun set behind him and the vast, empty desert stretched out ahead, was that something inside him had shifted. Something he couldn't ride away from anymore. And whether he liked it or not, his solitary, quiet life was about to end. 3 days passed. But Eli couldn't forget her. He threw himself into the work of his ranch, rising before the sun and falling into bed long after it set, mending fences and tending his horses, trying to lose himself in the familiar, exhausting rhythm of physical labor. But every time he paused to wipe the sweat from his face, he saw Miriam Harper's hollow cheeks and defiant eyes. Every time the wind kicked up a swirl of red dust, he remembered the way she'd walked down that street, carrying her shame like a cross. And worst of all, he kept seeing that little girl through the window, dark-haired and solemn, watching the world with eyes far too old for a 6-year-old child. He told himself again and again that it wasn't his concern. He'd done his good deed. He'd helped when no one else would. And that was enough. A man couldn't fix every broken thing in the world, especially not a man who'd already lost everything that mattered to him once before. Trying to save someone else was a fool's game. But on the morning of the 4th day, Eli found himself in his barn, staring at 2 sacks of seed corn he'd saved from last season. Good, hearty seed that he didn't really need, sitting there going to waste while a woman and her child were slowly starving just 40 miles away. Before he could talk himself out of it, before the ghosts of his past could chain him to his solitude, he loaded one of the sacks onto his pack-horse. "Just extra supplies," he muttered to himself as he swung into the saddle, the lie tasting bitter even as he said it. It'd go to waste otherwise. He knew it was more than that. He was being drawn back, pulled by a current he couldn't fight. The Harper place was even worse than he'd imagined. When it finally came into view, a lonely speck on the vast, cracked earth, Eli had to stop his horse and just stare. The homestead looked like it was barely holding itself together through pure, stubborn will. The roof was a patchwork of mismatched boards and scavenged pieces of tin that caught the harsh sunlight. Half the fence had fallen over, the posts rotted through at the base. What should have been a garden was nothing but a plot of cracked, barren earth, dead as bone. And in the yard stood the little girl. She didn't run or hide when she saw him coming. She didn't smile or wave like a normal child might. She just stood there in a faded, threadbare dress, watching him approach with that same solemn, unnerving expression he'd seen through the store window. Her dark hair hung in two careful braids, and her face was thin with a hunger that had become a permanent part of her features. But it was her eyes that struck him most, weary and watchful, carrying a burden that no 6-year-old should ever have to know. Eli touched the brim of his hat to her as he dismounted. "Morning, miss." She didn't answer, just kept watching him, her small head tilted as if she were trying to decide if he was dangerous. Before Eli could knock on the warped wooden door, it creaked open. Miriam Harper stood there, a large kitchen knife gripped in her hand, held low by her side but ready. She looked like a woman who'd fought too many battles and was prepared, always, to fight another. Her eyes were hard, her jaw set in a line of defiance. But when she recognized him, something flickered across her face, surprise, maybe even a flash of relief, before it was quickly hidden behind a wall of suspicion. "Mr. Rollins," she said, her voice carefully neutral, betraying nothing. "Eli," he corrected gently. "I brought some seed corn, had extra. Thought it might help you get a garden started before the season's lost." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face for the real reason, the hidden angle. "Thought maybe the poor widow could use more of your charity?" she asked, her voice laced with a sharp, protective pride. "Thought maybe someone trying to keep a garden alive in a drought could use good seed that's just sitting useless in my barn," he replied evenly, meeting her gaze without flinching. He wouldn't let her pride chase him away. They stood there facing each other, a silent battle of wills playing out in the oppressive heat. Miriam's grip on the knife stayed firm. Eli kept his hands visible and non-threatening, resting them on his hips. The moment stretched out between them, heavy with everything unsaid, her fear, his sincerity, the incredible risk they were both taking just by having this conversation in a town that watched their every move. Finally, with a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the whole world, Miriam's shoulders dropped slightly. She lowered the knife. "I suppose you'd better come in," she said quietly, the words of surrender costing her dearly. Inside, the house was sparse but spotlessly clean. 3 mismatched chairs sat around a scarred wooden table. A small wood stove in the corner held a single dented pot. The shelves on the wall held barely more than the supplies he'd seen her buy in town. The flour, salt, and lard stretched to last as long as humanly possible. Everything in the single room spoke of a desperate poverty held at bay only by fierce dignity and endless, exhausting determination. "Sarah," Miriam called softly, and the little girl entered, moving close to her mother's skirts like a small, silent shadow. She curtsied politely, a gesture so formal it was heartbreaking. Someone had taught her manners, but her wide, dark eyes never left Eli's face. "Would you like some water, Mr. Rollins?" Miriam asked, and Eli could hear what it cost her to offer even that small hospitality when her own well was likely running low. "I'm fine, thank you," he said gently. "I only came to drop off the seed, and maybe share a few tricks about planting it right in this drought soil. It won't take long." Miriam studied him for another long moment, searching his face again for the hidden motives, for the trap she was sure was there. Whatever she saw, or didn't see, made her give a slow, reluctant nod. "Show me then," she said. For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side in what was left of her garden plot. Eli showed her how to plant the seeds deep, where the last of the ground's moisture might be found. He showed her how to shape the soil into small basins to catch and hold what little rain might come. How to water only at dawn and dusk to keep the precious moisture from evaporating in the brutal afternoon heat. Miriam watched him carefully and followed his instructions without a word, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency, despite the raw blisters he could see forming on her palms. She never complained, never asked to rest, just worked with a grim, silent determination that Eli found himself admiring more and more. Sarah followed them around the small garden, carrying seeds in her apron. She hardly spoke, but her wide eyes tracked Eli's every movement, taking in everything. Once, when he looked up, he caught her staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It was a mixture of curiosity, longing, and a deep ingrained fear. When the sun started its slow drop toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Eli called a halt. He noticed the way Miriam swayed slightly when she stood up, the way exhaustion pulled at her thin frame like a physical weight. He'd seen how hunger had carved away at both mother and daughter, leaving them sharp-edged and fragile like glass. "That's enough for today," he said, brushing the dry dirt from his hands. "Seeds need time to settle before the next watering." Miriam wiped her forehead with a dirty sleeve, leaving a smudge of earth across her face. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Rollins." "No thanks needed," Eli said. "Just neighbors helping neighbors." She laughed, but it was a bitter, broken sound with no joy in it. "Neighbors? You're the only man in this whole county willing to be seen anywhere near this place." Eli had no answer to that truth. It hung in the air between them, stark and ugly. He just gathered his things and headed for his horse, ready to mount up and ride back to his solitary life, feeling like he'd done what he could. But as he swung into the saddle, Sarah stepped forward. Her small face was solemn and serious, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, carrying a weight far beyond her years. "Mr. Cowboy," she said. Eli looked down at her, surprised. "Yes, miss? Are you a good man or a bad man?" "Sarah!" Miriam's voice was sharp with embarrassment, but Eli held up a hand to stop her. He'd been asked many questions in his life, but somehow this one, from a 6-year-old girl who'd already seen too much of the world's ugliness, struck deeper than any other. He thought about it for a long moment. Then slowly, deliberately, he climbed back down from his saddle. He knelt in the dust so he could look her straight in the eyes, so she would know he was taking her question seriously. "I try to be good," he said honestly, "but I don't always succeed." "Why do you ask?" Sarah's voice stayed quiet but clear, each word carefully chosen. "Mama says good men don't hurt little girls or their mamas, but the men in town say bad things to Mama, and they're supposed to be the good men. So, how do you know who's really good?" The words hit Eli like a physical punch to the chest. He glanced up at Miriam and saw a universe of shame and pain written across her face. Shame that her daughter had to ask such a question. Pain that she couldn't protect her from the world's casual cruelty. "Sometimes," Eli said carefully, choosing his own words with equal care, "people get confused about what's good and what's bad. They listen to gossip and lies instead of looking at the truth with their own eyes. But I want you to know something, Sarah. Your mama is a good woman, one of the very best I've ever met. Don't you ever let anyone tell you different." Sarah's solemn expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. A tiny spark of hope maybe, or the relief of having her own belief confirmed. Then, without any warning, she threw her thin arms around his neck and hugged him tight. The hug lasted only a moment before she pulled back, suddenly shy, and ran to her mother's side. But that brief, desperate embrace stayed with Eli long after he mounted his horse for the second time and turned toward home. As he rode away, the sun painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and red, Eli knew he was lying to himself. This wasn't just about wasted seed or being neighborly anymore. Something about that woman's fierce, unbreakable dignity and that child's old, wounded eyes had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. He was involved now. Deeply involved. That night, storm clouds rolled in from the west, dark and angry. Eli lay in his bed at the ranch, listening to the distant thunder rumble across the prairie like a gathering army. Soon, rain began to hammer against his sturdy roof, and flashes of lightning cracked the sky open with brilliant, blinding white light. He tried to sleep, but each crash of thunder dragged his thoughts back to Miriam and Sarah in that crumbling, pathetic house. Were they dry? Were they safe? That patchwork roof looked like it could barely hold back a strong wind, let alone a real storm like this one. He told himself it wasn't his problem. They'd survived before he came along, and they'd survive now. He'd done more than most men would have. He'd crossed lines already just by helping them plant a garden. Getting any more involved would only bring more trouble down on all their heads. But when another deafening roar of thunder shook his windows, followed by a flash of lightning that lit up his entire bedroom in stark black and white, Eli gave up pretending. He threw off his blankets, pulled on his boots and coat, and headed for the barn. His horse protested being saddled in the middle of a raging storm, but Eli was determined. He swung into the saddle and turned the animal's head east, toward the edge of Dry Creek, toward a broken-down farmhouse and two people who'd somehow become his responsibility without him ever meaning for it to happen. The ride was brutal. Rain turned the trail to a thick, sucking mud that fought his horse's hooves with every step. Water streamed down Eli's face, blinding him. Lightning split the sky so close he could smell the sharp electric tang in the air. But he pushed forward through the storm, driven by an instinct he couldn't name and wouldn't have admitted to even if he could. When the Harper house finally appeared in a flash of lightning, Eli's heart dropped into his stomach. Even from a distance, he could see that something was terribly wrong. And then he heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of the thunder and the drumming of the rain. A child's terrified, desperate screaming. Eli spurred his horse harder, mud spraying up from the animal's hooves. As he got closer, he could see water pouring through a dozen gaping holes in the roof like waterfalls. The front door hung open, banging violently in the wind. Sarah's screams grew louder, more hysterical. He didn't bother tying his horse. He just jumped down from the saddle and ran for the house, his boots splashing through puddles that were already ankle-deep. Inside was chaos. Water poured in from everywhere, the roof having given way in multiple places. The floor was slick with mud and pooling rain. Buckets and pots were scattered across the room, a useless defense against the flood pouring down from the sky. Miriam stood in the middle of it all, her hair hanging in wet ropes down her back, her dress soaked through. She moved frantically from one leak to another, trying to catch the water with whatever she could find. But for every one she caught, two more seemed to appear. She was fighting a battle she couldn't possibly win. "Let me help!" Eli shouted over the roar of the storm. Miriam spun around, her face a mask of desperation. For just a moment, a wave of pure relief washed across her features, before she masked it again with her stubborn pride. "The roof's going!" she shouted back. "I can't stop it!" Even as she spoke, a horrible splintering crack came from above. A large section of the roof sagged dangerously, water pooling in the depression. It was going to collapse at any second. "Get what you need," Eli ordered, his voice cutting through her panic with absolute authority. "We're moving to the barn, now!" For once, Miriam didn't argue. She grabbed a burlap sack and started shoving clothes into it. Sarah's things first, then her own. She swept the precious supplies from the shelf into her apron, her movements quick and efficient. Meanwhile, Eli scooped Sarah up into his arms. The little girl was hysterical, her whole body shaking with violent sobs. She clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart, her small arms wrapped tight around his neck, her face buried in his shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart," Eli murmured into her wet hair, his voice a low, calming rumble. "I've got you. You're safe now." They stumbled through the driving rain toward the barn, Sarah buried against Eli's chest, Miriam clutching her sack of meager belongings. Behind them, they heard a tremendous, deafening crash as another section of the roof gave way, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Miriam let out a choked sob but kept moving forward, not looking back. The barn was dark, but, blessedly, it was dry. The rain drummed on the roof above them, but it held firm. Eli set Sarah down gently and immediately went to work. He moved bales of hay to block the wind coming through the gaps in the walls. He found an old metal bucket and, using some dry kindling he found in a corner, built a small, contained fire inside it, just enough to give them some warmth and a little light. He spread out the driest horse blankets he could find, creating a makeshift bed on a pile of clean straw. Then he took off his own coat, which was still relatively dry on the inside, and wrapped it around Miriam and Sarah, huddling them together. "You'll freeze," Miriam protested weakly, but there was no strength behind her words. She was shivering uncontrollably. I'll manage, Eli said firmly. That child won't. Neither will you. They huddled together near the small fire while the storm raged outside. A tiny island of warmth in a world of cold and chaos. Sarah's terrified sobs gradually quieted to hiccups, then to exhausted whimpers, and finally to silence as sleep mercifully overtook her. Miriam held her daughter close, her own hands still trembling, whether from cold or shock or both. Eli couldn't tell. For a long time, nobody spoke. They just sat there listening to the rain, to the thunder rolling across the prairie, to the soft, even sound of Sarah's breathing. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn barn walls. Finally, Miriam spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's gone, isn't it? The house." Eli wanted to lie, to offer some false comfort, but she deserved the truth. "The roof's half down," he admitted quietly. "Maybe more by morning, but the walls are still standing. It can be rebuilt." Miriam's laugh was a bitter, broken thing. "With what? I spent my last coins on that flower. We have nothing left. No money, no home. Nothing." "We'll figure something out," Eli said, the words feeling inadequate even as he said them. She turned to look at him then, her eyes dark and deep, reflecting the firelight. "There is no we, Mr. Rollins. This isn't your fight. You've already done more than anyone else in this world would have. But I can't ask you to—" "Eli," he interrupted quietly. "And you're not asking. I'm offering." "Why?" The question came out broken, desperate, the one thing she couldn't understand. "Why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." A loud clap of thunder rolled directly overhead, giving Eli a moment to think. He could give her the easy answers. He could talk about being neighborly, about Christian duty, about doing the right thing. But sitting there in the flickering firelight with this woman who had lost everything and still held her chin high, with her daughter sleeping peacefully for the first time in God knows how long simply because she finally felt safe, easy answers weren't enough. They felt like a lie. "Maybe I don't know you," he said slowly, his voice low and firm. "But I'm making it my business to. A town full of men left you and your girl out here to face this storm alone. That makes it my business." Her eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the rain. "I don't understand." "Some things are worth fighting for," Eli said, and he was surprised by how much he meant it, by the conviction he heard in his own voice. "And I reckon you and that little girl are two of them." A single tear slipped down Miriam's cheek, then another. She tried to hold them back, tried to maintain the fierce dignity she wore like armor. But it was too much. The storm, the destroyed house, the unexpected, undeserved kindness of this quiet man who kept showing up exactly when she needed him most. It all crashed over her like the rain outside. "I'm so tired of fighting," she whispered, the words a confession of utter exhaustion. "I know," Eli said gently. "So let me fight for you for a while." They sat in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence. Softer, safer. Outside, the storm finally began to ease. The thunder moved off into the distance, its anger spent. The rain slowed from a roar to a steady, rhythmic patter. But inside the barn, something had fundamentally changed. A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. They were no longer strangers. Dawn finally broke, clear and bright, as if the storm had been nothing more than a bad dream. But when they stepped outside the barn, the harsh morning light revealed the full extent of the damage. The Harper house was a ruin. Half its roof was gone, exposing the soaked interior to the sky. The warped wooden walls looked ready to collapse. What little furniture they'd had was smashed and waterlogged. The place couldn't survive another storm. It might not even survive a strong wind. Miriam stood staring at the wreckage. Sarah pressed against her side. Her face was carefully blank, a mask showing nothing. But Eli could see the way her shoulders trembled, the way she was holding herself together by pure, desperate force of will. "You've done enough," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Go back to your ranch, Eli. Before this ruins you too. before the whole town turns against you for good for helping us." Eli shook his head, his decision already made. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "With lumber and tools, we'll start fresh. Mr. Rollins, Eli, I don't walk away from people I've chosen to stand with," he said. And he turned to look at her then, to really look at her. Her eyes searched his, full of fear and a fragile, terrifying hope. "They'll make your life hell for this." "Let them try," Eli said simply. And he meant it. Whatever came next, gossip, threats, violence, he'd face it. Because for the first time in years, since long before his own family had been taken from him by fever, Eli Rollins had something worth fighting for again. True to his word, Eli returned the next morning. His wagon was loaded high with fresh lumber, boxes of nails, and a collection of tools that showed years of hard use. Together, they began the impossible task of rebuilding. For days that turned into weeks, they worked side by side from sunup to sundown. They tore down what couldn't be saved, the splintered wood a funeral pyre for Miriam's old life, and began to build a new, stronger frame. Miriam worked with a stubborn determination that matched his own. Her hands, soft at first, quickly blistered and then hardened into calluses, but she never stopped, never complained. Sarah, seeing her mother's resolve, became their little helper, carrying nails in her apron and fetching water from the well, proud of every small task. Slowly, impossibly, the house began to take shape again. It was smaller, simpler, but it was solid. Each nail driven into the fresh wood seemed to bind the three of them closer together. Eli found himself looking forward to the mornings when he'd ride over the rise and see Sarah waiting for him in the yard, her face lighting up with a genuine smile when she spotted him. He liked the way Miriam sometimes laughed without meaning to when he made a bad joke. He liked the comfortable silences that settled between them on the new porch in the evenings as they shared simple meals of beans and bread, the setting sun painting the sky. But the town noticed, and the town did not approve. One hot, still afternoon, 3 riders appeared at the newly mended gate. Sheriff Watson sat tall and imposing in his saddle, flanked by a smirking Tom Garrett and another rancher, Pike Stevens. Their faces were dark with judgment, their presence a cloud over the hard-won peace. "Rollins," the sheriff called out, his voice sharp and official. "Folks in town are talking. A single man spending all his days and some of his nights at a widow's place. It ain't proper." Eli didn't stop hammering but rested his hand on the handle, his knuckles white. It was close enough to where his gun belt hung on a nearby post. "Seems to me fixing a roof that a storm took is proper work, Sheriff. Neighborly, even." Tom Garrett spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dirt, narrowly missing Eli's boots. "She poisoned her husband, Rollins. Everyone knows it. You're making a big mistake hitching your wagon to her." Miriam stepped forward then, her face smudged with dirt, her dress dusty and her hands scraped raw from the work. But she stood tall and proud, and Eli saw that fire flash in her eyes again. "Everyone knows lies, Mr. Garrett," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "Not one person in that town you call proper lifted a finger when that storm left my child with a leaking roof over her head. Mr. Rollins did. If that shames you, gentlemen, then it's your shame to carry, not ours." The men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Pike Stevens had the decency to look away, but Garrett's face only hardened with anger. "You'll drag him down with you, widow," Garrett sneered. "Mark my words." "Enough," Eli said coldly, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "If you came here to work, pick up a hammer. If not, ride on." They left, but their muttered threats hung in the hot, still air like smoke. The warning was clear. Trouble was coming for them. It came a week later. Eli rode into town for more supplies, a necessary trip he had been putting off. As he came out of Morrison's store, 5 men were waiting for him. Garrett was there, along with 4 of his ranch hands, half drunk and spoiling for a fight. They surrounded him before he could even get to his horse. "Look here, boys!" one of them shouted, shoving Eli hard from behind. "It's the witch widow's protector." The first punch came fast, a blur of knuckles that split Eli's lip and filled his mouth with the coppery taste of blood. The second was a hard shot to the gut that doubled him over, knocking the wind out of him. But Eli had been in plenty of fights in his younger days, and his body remembered the brutal dance. He came up swinging, his fists hard and heavy, putting two of the men flat on their backs in the dust before the others could grab his arms and hold him still for Garrett. "You've chosen your side, Rollins," Garrett spat, his face inches from Eli's. He landed a hard right to Eli's eye. "This won't end well for you, or for her." A shotgun blast suddenly echoed through the street, and the men scattered as Sheriff Watson finally decided to intervene. The fight was broken up, but the message had been delivered. Bruised and bleeding, Eli didn't wait for the sheriff's questions. He got on his horse and rode straight back to the Harper place. Miriam met him at the door, her face going pale and her hand flying to her mouth at the sight of his swollen eye and split lip. "This is what I feared," she whispered, pulling him inside. Her hand shook as she gently cleaned his wounds with a wet cloth, her touch sending a jolt through him. "This is my fault. You're paying the price for standing with us." "This is my fight now," Eli said, his voice steady despite the pain shooting through his ribs with every breath. He caught her trembling hand in his and held it. Her hands paused in their work. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. "Why, Eli? Why are you risking everything? Your reputation, your safety, your whole life. Why?" He held her gaze, and for the first time, he let the walls he'd built around his heart come down, just for a moment. "Because I won't stand by while you and Sarah are left alone to face this town's hate. Because when I look at you, I don't see the trouble they talk about. I see a woman worth every single risk. I see someone who deserves to be fought for." Tears welled in her eyes and slipped down her cheeks. "I don't want to hope, Eli," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Hope hurts too much when it's taken away." Eli reached up with his other hand and gently, tenderly, wiped her tears away with his thumb. "Then hope anyway," he said softly. Their faces were close now, so close he could feel the warmth of her breath on his skin. For a long moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. Her dark eyes searching his, her hand trembling in his grip. The space between them was charged with everything they hadn't said, everything they were both too scared to feel. He started to lean forward, and she didn't pull away. "Mama?" Sarah's small voice came from the doorway, breaking the spell. They stepped apart quickly, two magnets repelling. Miriam wiped her eyes and turned to her daughter with a shaky, forced smile. But something had shifted between them. A line had been crossed, a truth acknowledged, and it couldn't be taken back. From that day forward, things were different. Eli spent more time at the Harper place than at his own ranch. He brought food from his own stores, fixed the last of the problems with the house, and even taught Sarah how to ride on a gentle old pony he brought over. The little girl, who had been so silent and solemn, blossomed under his quiet attention, her laughter echoing across the yard, a sound Miriam thought she might never hear again. In the evenings, after Sarah was asleep inside, Eli and Miriam would sit on the porch steps, talking quietly about everything and nothing. They talked about the stars, about the drought, about their dreams for a future that seemed both impossible and tantalizingly close. But the danger they faced still circled them like wolves around a campfire, waiting for the flames to die down. One night, the peace was shattered by angry, drunken voices. Rocks crashed through the newly repaired windows, sending shards of glass flying across the room. Sarah woke up screaming as a half-dozen men on horseback circled the small house, jeering and shouting in the darkness. "Murderer!" they yelled. "Witch! You'll burn in hell for what you did!" Eli grabbed his rifle, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't aim at them. He fired 2 warning shots into the air, the sound booming in the night. The riders, cowards at heart, scattered back into the darkness, their cruel laughter fading into the distance. But the message was clear. They would not be left in peace. This was only the beginning. The next morning, as Miriam tried to sweep up the broken glass while Sarah clung to her skirts, still trembling, Eli made his decision. "Pack what you can carry," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "You're both coming back to my ranch. It's on higher ground, easier to defend. You'll be safer there." Miriam hesitated, her fierce pride warring with the raw, undeniable fear on her face. Eli, I can't. I can't be your burden. Please, Mama. Sarah's small voice interrupted, her face buried in her mother's dress. She looked up with wide, terrified eyes. I want to go. I want to live where the bad men can't find us. Please. Miriam looked down at her daughter's terrified face, then back at Eli's steady, unwavering presence. The fight went out of her. Slowly, she nodded. They packed what little they had, patched clothes, worn dishes, a few treasured possessions that had survived the storm. As they loaded everything onto Eli's wagon and left the rebuilt Harper house behind, Miriam didn't look back. That place held nothing for her anymore but painful memories and the constant threat of violence. Now, whatever came next, they would face it together. Eli's ranch was everything the Harper place wasn't. It was solid, well built, and sat on a high piece of ground with clear, sweeping views in all directions. No one could approach without being seen. That first night, Miriam stood on the porch while Sarah slept soundly inside, looking up at the vast, star-filled sky. It felt like the first time she had been able to breathe freely in years. "What are we doing, Eli?" she asked quietly, the question hanging in the cool night air. He came to stand beside her and took her hand, his rough, calloused palm warm and strong against her fingers. "We're building something new," he said, "if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment, the fear and hope battling in her eyes. Then, slowly, she nodded, a silent promise passing between them. 2 weeks of peace followed, a small, precious gift. Sarah thrived in the safety of the ranch, helping with chores and laughing freely, the shadows finally receding from her eyes. Miriam cooked and mended and tended a small garden by the main house, her hands finding comfort in the familiar work. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch, a quiet, unspoken rhythm forming between them. They were starting to look and feel like a real family. But Miriam still jumped at unexpected sounds, still scanned the horizon, still waited for the other shoe to drop. She knew the town's hatred wouldn't just fade away. One afternoon, a lone rider approached. It was Doc Hastings, his face grave. He was one of the few decent men left in Dry Creek, a man who had treated her husband and had always been kind to her. "I came to warn you," he said, dismounting heavily, his age showing in his movements. "There was a town council meeting last night. Garrett and Morrison pushed it through. They've drawn up legal papers, claiming Miriam is an unfit mother on grounds of moral character. The circuit judge signed off on it. The sheriff has official authorization to take Sarah to the state orphanage in Silver Ridge." He looked at Miriam, his eyes full of pity. "They're coming for her. In 3 days." The words hit like a physical blow. Miriam went white, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Sarah, playing nearby with a kitten, heard everything. Her small face crumpled with a fear so profound it was terrifying to see. "They can't," Miriam whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "She's my daughter. She's all I have." "I testified on your behalf," Doc said sadly. "Told them you were a good mother, that Jacob's death was his own doing. But they wouldn't listen. Their minds were already made up. I'm sorry, Miriam. I'm so sorry." After the doctor left, a heavy silence fell over the ranch. Eli found Miriam in the barn, her shoulders shaking with muffled sobs, trying to cry where Sarah wouldn't hear her. He pulled her into his arms and just held her, letting her cry against his chest, her grief a storm he could only shelter her from, not stop. "We can't run," she said brokenly when the tears finally subsided. "The law will follow us anywhere we go. They'll hunt us down." "Then we don't run," Eli said, his voice firm, a rock in her sea of despair. "We fight. We prove your innocence once and for all. Someone in that town knows what really happened to your husband, Jacob. We find them. We get the truth out into the light." The next day, Eli rode alone into Dry Creek, not as a rancher buying supplies, but as a man on a mission. He went straight to the saloon where Jacob Harper used to spend most of his time and money. The bartender, an old man named Pete, looked nervous when Eli walked in, and the room went quiet. Eli ordered a whiskey and waited, listening to the men around him talk. Finally, he asked Pete directly. What kind of man was Jacob Harper? Pete glanced around nervously, wiping the bar with a dirty rag. Drank too much, he muttered. Owed money. To the wrong people. Pete's eyes flicked for a split second to the corner where Tom Garrett sat watching them, a smug look on his face. Gambling debts. Big ones. The week before he died, some of Garrett's men beat him badly out behind this place. Thought they'd killed him then. The pieces started falling into place in Eli's mind. It wasn't just about a piece of land. It was about money. If Jacob died, his massive debts to Garrett died with him. But if his widow, Miriam, could be blamed for his death and driven off the land, or better yet, locked away, then the Harper land, with its valuable water rights, could be seized by the county and sold cheap. Garrett and his friend, the storekeeper Morrison, who held the original mortgage, would profit handsomely. Eli found Dr. Carson next, the man who had examined Jacob's body. The old doctor looked haunted, his hands shaking as he poured himself a drink. What really killed Jacob Harper? Eli asked, his voice low and direct. Carson flinched. He wouldn't meet Eli's eyes. His liver. It was destroyed from years of hard drinking. It was natural causes, pure and simple. I told the sheriff as much. He finally looked up, his eyes filled with shame. But Morrison and Garrett, they paid me to stay quiet. They said it was just easier to blame the widow than to admit we all just stood by and looked the other way while Jacob drank himself into an early grave. Will you testify to that? In a real court? Eli pressed. The doctor hesitated, his fear warring with his guilt. Then, slowly, he nodded. I've carried this guilt long enough. Yes, I'll testify. Eli gathered more witnesses. The young store clerk who'd seen Jacob buy laudanum for himself multiple times, complaining of the pain from the beating. A farmer who'd watched Jacob medicating his pain with whiskey and pills. A clear pattern emerged. A conspiracy of greed, lies, and a town's willingness to destroy an innocent woman to cover up its own sins and failings. The night before the sheriff was due to arrive, Eli and Miriam sat together on the porch under the stars. Neither of them could sleep. The quiet of the ranch felt heavy, charged with dread. If they take her tomorrow. Miriam's voice broke. She couldn't finish the sentence. Eli turned and cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. They won't, he said with a certainty he didn't entirely feel. I promise you, Miriam. They will not take her. I promise. He kissed her then. A kiss born of desperation and promise, and everything they hadn't yet dared to say aloud. It was a kiss that sealed their unspoken pact. When they finally pulled apart, both of them had tears on their cheeks. I love you, Miriam whispered, the words finally spoken. I love you too, Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. And I'm going to protect our family. Morning came too quickly. A bright, beautiful day that mocked the ugliness that was coming. Just after dawn, 6 riders appeared on the horizon, dark figures against the rising sun. Sheriff Watson, Tom Garrett, Chester Morrison, and 3 grim-faced deputies. Sarah was hidden inside the house, but her frightened whimpers could be heard even on the porch. Eli and Miriam stood together, side by side, waiting. The sheriff dismounted, holding a set of official-looking papers in his hand. Miriam Harper, he announced loudly, his voice carrying in the still morning air. By order of the Dry Creek Town Council and the authority of this county, we are here to take legal custody of your daughter, Sarah Harper. You have been deemed an unfit mother. Miriam's legs gave out from under her. She fell to her knees in the dirt, all her pride and dignity stripped away by raw animal terror. Please, she begged, tears streaming down her face, her voice a shattered whisper. Please don't take my child. She's all I have. I didn't kill my husband. I swear I didn't. Please, I'm begging you. From inside, Sarah's scream pierced the air. Mama, Mama, don't let them take me. Morrison moved toward the door, a cruel grin on his face. Garrett laughed. The deputies shifted uncomfortably, but prepared to follow their orders. Then Eli stepped forward, his rifle raised and ready. No one, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron, is taking that child. The sheriff's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. You're interfering with the law, Rollins. I'm preventing a crime, Eli corrected, his eyes locking onto the sheriff's. He looked at each man in turn. And I have the evidence that proves it. He pulled a stack of papers from his coat pocket. Dr. Carson's signed and sworn testimony about the true cause of death. Old Pete's statement about the gambling debts and the beating. The store clerk's account of the laudanum sales. One by one, he presented the facts, his voice clear and steady. Jacob Harper died of natural causes from years of drinking. The debts he owed were to Tom Garrett, and the men who stood to gain the most from his death and his widow's ruin were Garrett and Chester Morrison, who planned to seize the Harper land and its water rights. Eli's voice rose, filled with cold fury. They manufactured a murder charge to destroy Miriam's reputation and get her property cheap. This isn't justice. It's theft, wrapped in a lie. Morrison's face went beet red. That's nonsense, lies. You have no proof. I have witnesses, Eli shot back. Witnesses willing to testify in a real court of law, not a rigged town council meeting run by the men who stand to profit. The younger deputies exchanged nervous glances. One of them spoke up. Sheriff, if what he's saying is true. It's not true, Garrett snarled in desperation. He saw his plan, years in the making, falling apart. He drew his gun, his eyes wild. But he didn't point it at Eli. He pointed it straight at Miriam. I won't let some lying widow and her protector ruin everything. Before he could pull the trigger, Eli's rifle cracked. The bullet, fired with impossible speed and accuracy, hit Garrett's pistol, sending it flying from his hand in a spray of sparks and splintered wood. Garrett screamed, clutching his numb, injured fingers. Sheriff, Eli said calmly, his rifle now pointed directly at Morrison's chest. I suggest you arrest these two men for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. Or I will. Sheriff Watson looked at his deputies, at the damning evidence in Eli's hand, at the ugly truth he could no longer ignore. Slowly, he nodded. Tom Garrett, Chester Morrison, you're both under arrest. The moment the words were spoken, the front door burst open and Sarah flew out, throwing herself into Miriam's arms. They clung to each other, sobbing with a relief so profound it was painful. Eli stood guard, his rifle never wavering, until the arrested men were bound and taken away, their faces a mixture of shock and defeated rage. The trials that followed were swift and decisive. Within a week, Garrett and Morrison stood before the circuit judge, their conspiracy laid bare for all to see. The courtroom was packed with the same townspeople who had once whispered about poison and murder. Now they sat in stunned silence as witness after witness dismantled the web of lies. Dr. Carson's voice cracked with guilt as he testified about Jacob's destroyed liver, the natural death he had been paid to hide. Old Pete described the vicious gambling debts and the threats Garrett had made. The young store clerk produced receipts showing Jacob had bought his own laudanum, self-medicating for the pain of a beating no doctor could ease. When the judge's gavel finally fell, Garrett and Morrison were convicted on all charges, and Miriam Harper was declared entirely innocent of all accusations. She stood in that courthouse with Eli's arm around her, and Sarah clutching both their hands. And for the first time in 2 years, she wept freely. Not from grief or fear, but from a relief so overwhelming it shook her entire body. Back at the ranch, life began anew. Miriam could have returned to her old farm, rebuilt again. But too many ghosts lived within those walls. Too many painful memories. I don't want to go back, she told Eli one evening as they sat on his porch, watching the sunset. I want to stay here. I want this. I want us. Eli got off his chair and knelt before her. He had no ring, just his calloused hands that had planted her seeds and rebuilt her life. Miriam Harper, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Will you marry me? Let me be a father to Sarah. Let's build this life together, for good. She pulled him to his feet and kissed him, a kiss full of joy and promise. Yes, she whispered against his lips. Yes to all of it. Yes. From the doorway, Sarah cheered so loud that the horses stirred in their stalls. Their wedding was simple. Doc Hastings officiated under the wide-open sky, while Pete the bartender and a handful of other decent townspeople bore witness. Sarah acted as the flower girl, scattering wildflowers she had picked herself, her face beaming with a joy Miriam had feared she'd never see again. Eli wore his cleanest shirt. Miriam borrowed a simple dress. Neither of them had ever looked more beautiful. "I promise to stand with you, protect you, and love you. For all my days," Eli vowed, his eyes locked on hers. "I promise to trust you, honor you, and build our life with you," Miriam answered, her voice clear and strong. Sarah stood between them as they kissed, and in that moment, under the vast western sky, their family was sealed. Months passed like a beautiful dream. The ranch thrived under their shared care. Miriam's garden exploded with an abundance she'd never known. Sarah learned to read, helped with the animals, and her laughter became the constant, joyful soundtrack of their lives. She was no longer the solemn, weary child who had asked Eli if he was a good man or a bad man. One evening, a letter arrived from Sarah's new schoolteacher in town. It read, "Sarah has blossomed into a bright and happy girl. Whatever you are doing at home, keep doing it." Miriam cried happy tears as Eli held her close. "We're all going to be okay," he whispered into her hair. Even the town of Dry Creek slowly began to change. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid Miriam began to nod their greetings. Some of the men who had once stood against them softened. Eli's quiet courage had inspired something in them, a quiet but powerful shift toward decency. A year after the trials, a rider appeared at the ranch boundary. It was Tom Garrett, released early from prison, a broken and gray-haired man. Eli instinctively reached for his rifle. Miriam pulled Sarah behind her, but Garrett just stood there and raised his empty hands. "I ain't here for trouble, Rollins," he said, his voice raspy. "I just came to say I was wrong. About her. About everything." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve it. He just looked at Miriam for a long moment, then turned and walked away. As he was about to disappear over the rise, Miriam called out, "Mr. Garrett, I forgive you." His shoulders shook once, and then he was gone. "You didn't have to do that," Eli said, putting his arm around her. "Yes, I did," she replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "For me, not for him. I'm done carrying hate." Evening fell on the ranch, their ranch, now legally and truly theirs. Miriam sat on the porch swing, her hand resting on her growing belly, their second child stirring within. Sarah sat on the top step, reading aloud from her new book, while Eli's arm rested securely around his wife's shoulders. "Do you ever think about that day?" Miriam asked softly. "That day in the store?" "Every day," Eli answered. "Best $12 I ever spent." He smiled. "You saved us, you know." "We saved each other," Miriam corrected gently. "That's how family works." Sarah looked up from her book, her face serious. "Poppy Eli?" She'd started calling him that months ago, and every time she said it, his chest felt tight with a love he never thought he'd feel again. "Yes, sweetheart? Remember when I asked if you were a good man or a bad man?" "I remember." She smiled, a bright, pure light. "I know the answer now. You're the best man." Eli's eyes filled. He pulled Sarah into a fierce hug, and Miriam joined them, her arms wrapping around them both. 3 broken people, becoming 4, forming something stronger and more whole than any of them had ever been apart. Sometimes the quietest voice carries the most power. Sometimes standing up for one person can change an entire town. And sometimes the most broken souls can come together to create the strongest, most resilient families. Together, through every storm that was yet to come, they would stand, because that's what family does. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment with your favorite part, and subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption.